the Christian Circle podcast, and you're listening to Pamela Fernandes, where we have conversations about Christian living. Here's the show.
He was born Francisco or Franciscus, and a lot of the saints we've looked at, like Saint Augustine and Saint Paul, had like these major conversions in life, and then some of them, like Saint Faustina and Catherine of Siena, were kind of like born on the path of sanctity, and that's what Padre Pio was. He was kind of born to be a saint, but I mean, we all are, aren't we? So that's kind of, he was born like he grew up. He never really had that period in his life, like Augustine or Paul. Like I said, he was just set on this path to holiness from a young age, and supposedly as a child too, he could see visions of his guardian angels and Jesus and Mary, and he assumed that everyone else could too. That was just kind of a normal part of life for him. So he was in touch with supernatural and with sanctity from the earliest days of his life. A very interesting person.
And I think in his case, his family was very devout as well, right?
Yes.
And
yes, very devout family.
Yeah.
He said from, I think he was about 5 years old when he first said that he wanted to pursue a religious life. His family was very on board with it. They encouraged it. Yeah. And, very much like St. Teresa of Lisieux's family, how they were very encouraging of their daughters and, going after religious life. Yeah. He was encouraged by his family, and he pursued it. And actually his father, because they were very poor, from a very poor part of Italy, and his father, kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but he tried to join the local Franciscans, and they said that he needed more of an education, because he hadn't started school until later on in life because he had a lot of health problems, and he didn't have enough of an education. They couldn't really afford more education for him, so his father actually left and went to America and would send back money so that his son could get a tutor for several years until he was educated enough to become a friar.
And
so that's a lot of family support.
Yeah, and it's a good example because when you choose a vocation, it's sacrifice not just for the person who's making it, but for the family as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, we pray for priests all around the world, but then a lot of people, it's kind of a not in my backyard type mentality a lot of people have nowadays, like, oh yeah, we need more priests, but
not my son.
From someone else's family, right? Not my son, I want grandkids. But it's really not the right attitude to have, I guess. This is the example of the attitude that everyone should have, but it's a sacrifice, not just for the person making the sacrifice, but also for his whole family, like you said, and for women too, for people who have become nuns.
Yeah.
It's a sacrifice for them too.
What is his childhood like? Because he leaves at 15 and he becomes, he decides he's already on this road to priesthood. Yet he's on this, he's got all these different gifts. Like today we know that he's a mystic, he's got bilocation, he's got stigmata, he's got all these different things. And he's had all these visions since he was a kid. So he's actually been quite involved very early. Yeah,
from a very early age. He joined the Franciscans when he was 15. And then he was ordained in 1910, I believe, and he was allowed to stay at home, though, because usually a Franciscan would live in the monastery with the other Franciscan brothers. They live in a community, it was a religious community, but because of his health problems, he was allowed to stay at home, and he lived with his family for a while, and then he was ordered to actually move into the monastery, and one day, hearing confession, so it wasn't, he had the gifts of seeing, he would converse with his guardian angel, like have conversations like we're having now. Seems pretty extraordinary to us, but I guess for him, it just seemed like it was just as natural as breathing. And it wasn't until a little bit later on, he'd been a priest for a few years, that he was hearing confession one day. He had a searing pain in his hands and feet, and it was then that he got the stigmata, and he carried the stigmata the rest of his life, all the way till his death in 1968.
So for people who don't know, can you explain what the stigmata is?
Right, the stigmata, there's two kinds of stigmata. There's the visible and invisible stigmata. There's some people that have experienced the pain of the wounds of Christ. So typically it's the 2 holes in the hands or wrists and 2 holes in the feet. And sometimes it includes like a kind of a crown of thorns type wound, like on the forehead and stuff. And Padre Pio actually also suffered a wound in his side right towards the end of World War I. And it was, he said it was the piercing of his heart, the same way that Jesus' heart was pierced. So it's basically the wound of Christ that the person with the stigmata, I always seen the stigmata as kind of like a cross to bear, a burden placed upon you. But the people who's had the stigmata, people like St. Francis of Assisi and Catherine of Siena and Padre Pio, they seen it as a blessing to be able to suffer along with Christ. And I mean, St. Paul did the same thing. St. Paul had a thorn in the flesh. We don't know exactly what that was, but he talks about it. He asked God to remove this thorn from his flesh, and he said, my grace is sufficient for you. And that, he said that his suffering was building up what was lacking in the body of Christ. He rejoiced in his suffering. So that's what people with the stigmata, they rejoice in the fact that they have the same suffering as Christ, and they're getting to share and participate in his suffering.
And for those who don't believe, the stigmata that he did have was investigated, right? It was
Oh
investigated
yeah,
by
yeah, it was thoroughly investigated. It was actually towards the end of Pope Benedict XV's pontificate in 1921-22. There was kind of like a whisper campaign against Padre Pio, and they took away his ability to celebrate Mass in public, took away his ability to hear confessions, basically made him kind of like a hermit.
Yeah.
Wasn't allowed to do anything publicly, and they were going to move him to another monastery, but the local people threatened to riot, and so they backed off on those plans. But then it was a good time too, maybe 10 years, until Pope Pius XI reinstated all his priestly faculties, and said that he'd been kind of misled about what was going on with Padre Pio. So obviously there's some people, I don't know whether it was diabolical in nature or what the deal was, but there were some people that didn't like what he was doing. They thought, I don't know if they thought he was just a charlatan or if it was something, like I said, diabolical, if it was the devil involved, but they were trying to keep him down, and he suffered through it, and he went through all that kind of character assassination until he was vindicated. And then in the 60s, Pope Paul.VI, he came out and said that everything that was said about him was rubbish, and it was all, they investigated the claims that like he was using carbolic acid to keep the wounds open, and then it was all nonsense. It was actual. He had the wounds of Christ. It was real. He wasn't faking it. He wasn't some sort of scam artist. He was a saint. Well, they didn't actually canonize him at that moment. That came later. But he said that this actually happened, and the church looked into it, investigated, and found no other cause for it except for something supernatural in nature.
And it's a good example also about being subject to authority, because there's no complaint from him during that time period. He goes through all of this without complaint.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Of all the, that's what I kind of marveled at too. Of all the things that Padre Pio had going for him, like the bilocation, like you said, supposedly he levitated sometimes during Mass.
Yeah.
He had the ability to read hearts. He knew your confession when you come into the box with him before you even open your mouth.
Yeah.
He could bilocate, all these different things. But the one that we're all able to do, because those are all gifts, those are all graces, those are all gifts of God. So you can't just decide to bilocate tomorrow. But you can practice obedience, and you can practice patience.
Yeah.
And you can say with humility that it reminds me of two angels, Michael and Lucifer. Yeah. What's the difference between the two angels? One's archangel, one's Satan. Is Lucifer said, I will not serve. Yeah. And Michael serves as God's archangel. Yeah. So that's the thing that separated them. They're both angelic beings. They're both with perfect intellect. They're both these great, highly created creatures. But one chose not to humble himself before God and be obedient. Yeah. And one chose to be obedient and humble himself before God. And that's what Padre Pio done. So for 11 years, or 10 or 11 years, he was subject to this character assassination. And he could have went out and said, you know what, guys, I'm going to start my own church.
Yeah.
I've got a following here in Central Italy, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to start, the Church of Pio. Yeah. But he didn't. He said, okay, because St. Paul said, or in the letter, I think it was in Hebrew, so I don't know if St. Paul, he said to be subject yourself to the church authorities above you.
Correct, yeah.
And that's what Padre Pio done. He subjected himself to the authorities, even though it was unjust what they were doing to him. And he really had all these supernatural gifts, but he was obedient, and he was humble, and he took his licks, and he came out on top. It reminds me too of Job, from the Old Testament. A couple different people is Job, and even St. Paul. When St. Paul first came down to Jerusalem, he left. He came down to Jerusalem. Nobody really trusted him, and he left and went back to Tarsus. He sat in Tarsus for maybe 4 or 5 years before he was called upon to come to Antioch and be a teacher. So this is the greatest evangelist the world has ever known. Sat on his hands for 4 years because he was waiting for the church to call him, because it wasn't his place to call himself. He was sent. He was an apostle, but an apostle is one who was sent. So he practiced obedience, and he was humble. And when he was called and he got sent out, then he done great things. And that's what Padre Pio done.
Yeah. So once he comes back, does the war happen after that, or the war happens before that, and he's then serving in the war as well?
Oh yeah, World War I happened. So that was he got called up for military service. It was like towards the end of the war, like 1916 or 1917. So it was after he came home from that, is when the character assassination against him happened, because it was like 1922, towards the end of Benedict XV's pontificate, 1922, 1921, something like that. So it was after the war.
So he bears his responsibility towards his country, towards his church, towards his family. He does all of these things.
Yep.
Despite being a priest.
Despite being a priest, and despite being sick pretty much his entire life.
Yeah.
He was just illness after illness, and he suffered through it all with grace and dignity, just like I said, like Job from the Old Testament. Job was afflicted with one thing after the other, and the whole time he kept faith in God.
Now, after he's come back from
his time in the desert,
he's come back, and now his ministry takes off remarkably. I mean, there are people all over coming to him. I know of people because he was a very recent saint. When he died, it was in 1960. 1968. So I know people in Kuwait who were
68.
writing letters to him, and he would write back, and this
Yeah,
was his ministry.
yeah.
This ministry took off like in a very, very big way after he
Mhm.
comes.
Yeah, after he was kind of vindicated and he come back, so that was 1934. So there was 30 years, and he actually parlayed his popularity and everything into he built this big hospital in Italy, and so he used kind of his fame, I guess you would call it, for lack of a better word. He used his fame and celebrity for a good cause. Sometimes you see people like religious leaders and stuff, and they become famous, and then they use that to become popular, basically. Like they go on like talk shows and television shows, and they want to ingratiate themselves with the culture rather than speaking truth to the culture. Kind of like what Bishop Barron does, where Bishop Barron calls people out on it, and not in a confrontational way, but just says, this is the gospel. Some people end up going the other way and saying and kind of compromising on values, and you know what I mean. They kind of become more of the world rather than standing out and being a witness to the world, like Bishop Barron or even like Billy Graham. But he used his celebrity in a good way. So he went out and he got donations and he gathered up and built this hospital. And so that's kind of good use of celebrity and popularity, basically. And so he built the hospital in central Italy, and he done a lot of. People would come from all around. They said sometimes, because he'd hear confessions, lots of confessions. It's like one of his favorite things to do. And they said sometimes people would wait 5-6 hours in line to hear confession to confess to him. It'd be a pretty amazing thing, I guess. There's just certain people out there that you see like like Mother Teresa or John Paul II that we've seen in our lifetime. I wasn't around in '68, but I remember Mother Teresa when she was alive, and I remember John Paul II, and I remember thinking, these people, this is a saint. Back before I even believed in the whole communion of saints, I knew that if there is such thing as saints, these are them. And I guess people could see that off Padre Pio too, and wanted to be a part of it. Wanted to, the history of I confess to Padre Pio. It's a pretty amazing thing if you think about it.
And the thing is, because I've seen these people whose kids were in my class, and they keep saying, that their parents had started this devotion to Padre Pio before he was even canonized,
Right.
because they'd go to him for confession or write to him in letters. He already knew their problems before, like he had a facility. And I believe even for Pope John Paul II, he already prophesied that he was going to be somewhere really high up.
Yeah, I heard that. He told him that he'd be the highest level of the church. He assumed he meant a cardinal, but as we know, he became pope.
So what are some of his most famous writings? Because there's so much. In fact, I think every year there's a new book or there's something new about.
Oh yeah. Well, he was a prolific preacher too. So he'd preach on all these different topics and everything, and people would kind of he would take these nuggets, they're like transcripts of his sermons, and you could make a book out of just what he preached on just at Sunday Mass, But one of the things he kind of gave like a 5 steps to holiness. I really think that it really kind of resonated with a lot of people, and I try my best, but number 2 is very difficult for me because work schedule and stuff. But his 5 steps to increasing and growing in holiness, because he became famous as a spiritual advisor too. That's why his confession lines were so long. So people would go down and confess. He already knew all their sins. They'd confess them, and then he would give them kind of spiritual advice. And this was his famous, pray, hope, and don't worry. His famous little quote. That's probably the most famous quote from Padre Pio. But these 5 steps, I'd really like to integrate them more into my own life. And step 1 is weekly confession. He said, confession is a soul's bath. You must go at least once a week. I do not want souls to stay away from confession more than a week. Even a clean and unoccupied room gathers dust. Return after a week and you'll see that it needs dusting again. And that's true. I try to go to confession once every couple of weeks. Sometimes it's hard. But even if you don't have a mortal sin to confess, it's, we all fall short every day. And, if you do an examination of conscience, you'll see places where you've fallen short, places where you can grow more in holiness and stuff. And it's the truth. Even a room that's unoccupied still gathers dust. Number 2 is daily communion. And that one's a little more difficult for me, or for a lot of people that's working, because it's hard to get to Mass, especially morning Mass if it's during work hours and stuff. But I was recently on vacation on a cruise, and they had a priest on board, and I went to Mass almost every day for a 2-week cruise. And it was great. It was like a miniature retreat, a vacation and retreat all wrapped into one. So I do appreciate daily Mass, and I wish I could make it more often. But number 3 is an examination of conscience every day, a daily examination. And he recommended a morning examination of conscience and an evening one to kind of see where things went. And if you're doing an examination of conscience every day, even if it's just a quick 5 minutes before you go to bed, you really do see the areas where you need to sharpen your focus. You need to grow a little bit more. And it helps you too when you go to confession. You have them things you've examined over the last 7 days to try to grow on. And the number 4 is daily spiritual reading. And that can be the Bible, it can be the Catechism, it can be a papal encyclical. I really like doing Lectio Divina where you meditate on like a single verse, just pick one verse, and it's different. There's different methods for doing it.
Yeah.
The one that I really like is you pick a single verse and you read it. You read it one time through, and just kind of get the literal sense of what Jesus, or whatever. It's usually a verse from the gospel, what Jesus is saying. So like the literal, he's talking to, like say he's talking to Mary, Lazarus' sister, or Martha, and you read like, your brother will rise. Do you believe this? And then you read it again and imagine yourself in the room, and like you're a spectator to this. And then you read it a third time and you imagine that you're the one that Jesus is speaking it to. Like you're standing there, you're the subject of the conversation. And then you read it a fourth time and then you kind of respond like, what would your response be? And I think that's a great way to really meditate on a single, you can just pick one line of scripture and spend a half hour with it. And then number 5 is prayer at least twice a day. And so if you do these 5 steps of Padre Pio, it's really boundless spiritual growth.
And you can try it for a week and
Oh yeah. Try add one a week.
Yeah, add one a week. Yeah, and as far as confessions go, I know because psychiatrists usually recommend, especially in I know around here, if you go to a psychiatrist and he asks you, well, are you Catholic? The first thing he'll tell you is go to a confession and come back, because they believe in the power of confession.
Right, just the catharsis.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've never been to a psychiatrist before, but first time I went to confession 2 years ago when I first became Catholic, I come out of that confessional booth and I mean, I felt like I was 20 pounds lighter.
Yeah.
It really was amazing. Like, I can see why people pay the big bucks to lay on a couch, and we get it for free.
Yeah.
So, plus, a psychologist or psychiatrist can't give you absolution, so we got that going too.
Yeah.
It's free with spiritual benefits, not just mental benefits.
Yeah, and you can always ask your priest to give you advice to do a conversational confession. You can do it anyhow you like. I mean, they just want to hear confession. And just to remind people, the priest has just 2 jobs. One is to serve the Eucharist, and the other is to hear confessions. So anything else that happens in the church is your responsibility. But those 2 things are his job, and they will do it anytime.
Oh yeah, I know priests that'll just hear, like if you walk up to them and say, "Okay, Father, I got a quick confession." Oh sure, they're glad to hear confessions. And then there's people too that are like scared of, they're scared of what they're going to say to the priest, and they're, the priest going to think this or that of me. They've heard it all, and you hear that all the time. Like, they literally have heard it all.
Yeah.
I mean, they've heard everything, so you're not going to shock them. And there was one priest I heard, he said when he was in school, he was like a chaplain of school, and he offered $20 to any kid that could shock him in the confessional. And he said, he taught in school for whatever it was, 10 or 15 years. And he said, and I never did have to give anyone $20 because nothing was ever shocking. But it isn't just that; it is supposed to be a competition of who can sin the most. But they're not going to be shocked. And also, if you walk in that confessional and say, bless me, Father, for I've sinned, it's been 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever. It's been 40 years since my last confession. They're going to cry with joy that you're coming back to the sacraments. They're not going to scold you and say, why have you been late for so long? They're going to encourage you to, don't let it go another 40 years. Come back next week, or come back next month, or come to Mass on Sunday. But they rejoice at the return. Jesus said heaven rejoices at one sinner that repents. So that's what the priest rejoices too. So they're not going to scold you. They're not going to grab you by the ear and twist your ear. They're not going to be shocked by anything you have to say. They're going to be happy you're there, and they're going to say, welcome home.
So after these 5 steps, when people start incorporating them, are they expected to bilocate and become mystics?
Well, I don't know about that. That's all, like I said, that's all graces and gifts. But the things that you can do beside these 5 steps is you can practice humility and obedience. That's within all of our powers to do. The other stuff, the supernatural gifts, that's up to God to grant to each one of us. I don't want to levitate. That would freak my kids out, I think. But maybe the reading hearts would come in handy, knowing the kids are lying to you. But the levitating, I think I'll leave that with Padre Pio.
What else about his writing has changed? Like, I know he focuses a lot on prayer as well, and that I think with every saint we've managed to say this, that prayer becomes part of your routine. You have to do this.
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but when I was in RCIA, the priest who happened to be there at the parish at the time, he was like a temporary pastor, because our pastor of our parish had to resign because of health problems, so we got this temporary pastor, and he was great. He was a retired priest. He lived out in Sun City, with a retirement area in Arizona, and he asked the class in general, but I felt like he was asking me, one-on-one, do you pray? It's kind of a silly thing to ask a group of people who's mostly Christians that are all converting to Catholicism from different denominations and stuff, and that have been in this. I stopped and asked myself, no, I don't pray. I would go to church on Sundays, and I would join in the prayers there, and then I would pray if there was a cop behind me and I was speeding on the freeway, or if I thought I was taking a heart attack, with stress, I would pray then. or if my kid was sick and like I didn't know what was wrong, I'd pray then. But really, like, did I pray regularly? No, I didn't. And he said a Christian who doesn't pray isn't really a Christian. And, you know, at first, like I said, it shocked me. Like, yeah, of course we all pray. We've been in RCIA for 4 months. Yeah, we pray but really we did. Like, I couldn't speak for anyone else, but no, I didn't. I didn't pray. I was a Christian who didn't pray, which is an oxymoron.
Yeah.
So I started praying more often, and it kind of shocked me when I look back on it. Like I said, I only prayed when I needed God, when it was the genie in the lamp that I could rub, you know, because I needed a wish granted, or I needed some sort of petition granted of some kind, or I needed not to go to jail because I was doing 30 over the speed limit. You know, there was different reasons why I rubbed that lamp that God was contained in. But other than that, I didn't want to let God out. I didn't want him to be part of my life, really. And so that was kind of like one of them light bulb moments. You know? And so, yeah, prayer, that's what makes a Christian into a saint, is prayer. That really is the marker of every saint. All the saints are very similar, and they're very different at the same time. But the single thread that runs through every single one of them is they all had a strong prayer life. And since we're all called to be saints, we should all have a strong prayer life too. One follows from the other. So all saints have a strong prayer life. We should have a strong prayer life to become saints.